And finally, I want to thank Thermo Fisher Scientific for partnering with us on this event. Okay, so we are going to get started. And Bambi, I think I'd like to start with you. I think you have a very unique and interesting perspective, given that you are the Chief Regulatory Officer of ISCT. I want to level set the conversation around the regulatory landscape. If you could, let's briefly talk through the differences in regulatory landscapes in different regions. For example, the US versus the EU. And, if the same exact presentation were taking place in the EU right now, what would they be discussing that's different from what we're discussing? And so I'd love to get your take on the regulatory standards for approval between, say, the US and EMA.
So I want to start by
Oh, Bambi, are you muted?
There I am. Hello.
There you are. Thank you.
Okay. I want to start by saying that I think that a lot of this is the same across all of the different regions, and that when you look at approvals, there's a lot of congruence across the different regions. I think that in general, the developers and the sponsors are trying to prove that products are safe and effective. They're trying to convince the regulators of that. The regulators are trying to confirm that they're safe and effective, and then they're released to the public. I think that if you look at the number of approved products, which in June of last year was right at 100, you see that they're similarly approved across all of the different regions, and that includes North America, Europe, and Asia, with most of the approvals starting in North America, being followed shortly thereafter by Europe, and then usually with a slightly more delay being followed by approvals in Asia. There's a smaller amount of approvals in South America, and Oceania, and there aren't approvals in Africa, which is something that we might end up touching on a little bit later in this talk. I think that non-genetically modified cells lead the market as far as the different approvals. And that brings me to the topic that I think there is some divergence, which is the differences in donor eligibility across the regions of the world. And so I'm not sure that when you talk about therapeutics, that's something that a lot of people focus on, but it is a place where there are some significant differences in what the regulations look at like. And in fact, if we were in the EU right now, one of the topics that we'd probably be talking about is SOHO, the substances of human origin, which is very much of interest to them. I think that the US may follow that with some interest. It's not something that we're actively discussing at this point, but that's where I think you see some divergence. So I'm going to hand off to Kim and see if she has other thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that donor eligibility for those that are entangled in that, particularly for allogeneic products, that can be a frustration for the fact that there's not international harmonization, and there's not even full harmonization across the EU, different member states. So that continues to be an issue. I definitely agree about it does appear that most products are coming to North America first. I've noticed a trend that some are not, that some products that have been approved in the US are not necessarily trying to tackle the EU market. Like, for example, I noticed that Tecelra was approved this past year, but I have not seen that they are intending to file an MAA in Europe. So, I think there's still some reimbursement I guess it's not reimbursement in the EU, but the payment for those types of products, if there's not good economic benefit to seeking an approval in Europe. So I think that's still a concern about making sure these products are available globally. I am aware that there are fewer approvals in South America, but there are some countries use mutual recognition agreements to allow the products to be imported and used. I listened to interest from a regulator from Brazil, spoke at a panel at ASGCT earlier this year. Sorry, Bambi, I'm referring to ASGCT and not ISCT. No disrespect to ISCT. But the panel that if the product is approved somewhere else in the world, that a patient can petition the government of Brazil to make that product available to them. So that was interesting. It just imagine how approvals in one part of the world really can spread globally. I'd also want to mention that agencies are aware of some of the differences in regulation, or the interpretations that they're trying to work on regulatory harmonization efforts. Some of these efforts have been ongoing for a number of years and perhaps weren't that public because they were meetings that were held between regulators behind closed doors. Perhaps it's a good place for me to pause and make sure, for those that don't know, I've been 2 years at Dark Horse Consulting, but over 20 years at FDA as a regulator of cell and gene therapy products. So some things that come out of my mouth still sound like I'm representing CBER because it's there for so long. But there's a newer effort that FDA has talked about in several venues called Cogent, Collaboration on Gene Therapies pilot, of trying to make sure that, trying to emphasize the ability of agencies to share information. There's already the possibility that stakeholders can invite multiple regulators to the same meeting. That can be logistically difficult because of the meeting timelines. Like parallel scientific advice has existed for a long time, but when I was at FDA, it wasn't used that frequently, mainly because of those logistic considerations. But this is regulatory harmonization efforts. That's very important to try to share and reduce the burden on regulators. That's one goal, and I definitely for stakeholders hope it reduces the burden ultimately in harmonization of application procedures and content. Of can I file the same ECTD, the same content for across the world, obviously for marketing applications, but definitely for clinical trials too. That seems to be where it's the most divergent. So if there could be, more effort into that of, streamlining regulatory dossiers that are needed globally, that would be a great result of global harmonization.